Hello, welcome everyone, NYU students and members of the public. I'm Sarah Kramer. I'm a professor of audio reporting and in the audio reportage and podcasting program here at NYU. So this is a new program. It's directed by Ellen Horn and Chenjoy Kumanika, and it's specifically dedicated to teaching the craft of audio storytelling. And we have 9 incredible students in our first cohort who are reporting and producing some really fascinating and important stories right now. I see 3 of them here. So as part of this new endeavor, we are trying to bring some of the most creative people working in the audio industry to campus. So we want to spotlight producers who are pushing the boundaries of the medium, which is why I'm so excited to welcome Helena de Groot and John Delore from the Paris Review podcast. Yay. And when this podcast first launched, I was immediately very intrigued because, as I just told Helena, one of my first jobs after college was actually as a fact checker for the Paris Review. The very first email I sent from my brand new Gmail account in 2004 was to an editor at the Paris Review. So I'm dating myself. But this very part-time job was to fact-check author interviews that they had conducted over the years, starting in the 1950s. And they were going to put these interviews online for the first time. So they wanted to find out, if there were inconsistencies in what the authors said, and there were a lot of them. But I was working from the transcripts of the interviews. I didn't even know that there was any audio until I heard the Paris Review podcast. And Helena and John have taken such an original and playful approach for what to me feels like a very intimidating task. Because the Paris Review is probably the most prestigious literary magazine in the whole world. For 70 years, it's featured some of the best contemporary fiction and poetry, like James Baldwin, Allen Ginsberg, so many literary heroes. And I think that, at first, I was thinking, aren't, this is great works of fiction and poetry, but they're meant to be read. They're not necessarily written for the ear. So why make a podcast? Or that would be a really hard thing. But I think the proof is in the pudding. John and Helena have worked their magic and made something completely delightful. I feel like the orality of the Paris Review is unmatched. And hearing these short stories, essays, and poems offers the listener an experience that is impossible to just get from reading the words on the page. So whether it's the banter before an interview or scenes and sound design that make a poem immersive, you really with the Paris Review podcast make the case for audio as art. So how do you do it? So they will tell you now in this presentation. So I'm going to pass the mic to John and Helena. Thank you.
Hey,
Thank you so much.
All right. All right. Thank you. That was really, really nice. We're very, very happy to be here. Helena and I, when we started making this presentation, we just started doing it for each other. We just excitedly chatter to each other about this podcast and about literature all the time. So it's really nice to get to be able to do it in public in front of other people. So we are going to talk about how we make the Paris Review podcast. And my name is, let's start this way. My name is John Delore.
Okay, and I'm Helena de Groot.
And I think the thing that will really help is to just start with an illustration of, again, what Sarah was saying is some things really, really work in print. And then some things really work in sound. And in this case, we're trying to take things that are already in print and bring them into sound. So we're going to just start with an illustration of one moment from the Paris Review that is in the Paris Review, issue number 244. This was the interview with Sharon Olds, the poet, and this is the moment we're going to circle here. The poet Jessica Lazar interviewed Sharon Olds in her office here at NYU. And so in the intro, she's sort of talking, doing some, what we would call an audio scene setting, talking about 3 afternoons in November, just before she turned 80, and sort of setting the scene for where the interview took place. And there's this detail here that I've highlighted. During our time together, we ate Domino's pizza, butterscotch and Bordeaux-flavored truffles, and half-crushed donuts from Dream Fluff, her childhood favorite, which I'd brought with me from Berkeley. So that moment appears just in the intro. Now, we get the audio for this, the interview, all the hours that Jessica had recorded, and we sift through. And now I want to play for you what that moment sounds like in sound.
At the same time, I was born a pagan, and I still am one.
What does it mean to have been born a pagan?
Well, it's just a way of saying, nya, 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 to the kind of religion I was raised on. Meaning, when I was born, I was a little animal, like everyone. A little animal with good fortune. But oh, there's so much you weren't supposed to do that was so fun to do. Steal money and from your family and buy donuts at Dream Fluff. Do you know Dream Fluff on Ashby, just west of college?
Do you want to open your present now?
Yes.
I brought you a couple of donuts, but they're 2 days old and they're just...
Oh my God. It's a Dream Fluff. Oh, you sweetheart. You sweetheart. Thank you. This is so beautiful. Oh, thank you. Oh.
These are your headphones?
What should I do?
Okay, I'm just going to do the educational interlude here and just say a little bit about what is the Paris Review? Why is it even called Paris? It was started in Paris, that's why, in 1953 by George Plimpton, who was, like many Americans, hanging out in Paris because it was a little less suffocating than the prim and proper, very racist Eisenhower America of the time. And after a few years, he was back in New York, and they were publishing fiction, poetry, and especially interviews. And these interviews are sort of what the Paris Review is iconic for. They go over, they're conducted over the span of many months, sometimes years. So the interviewer goes back and back over and over again to this writer, and then compiles these interviews into something like a career-defining piece of print. So most importantly, of course, when they do these interviews, they're not made for audio. So sometimes they are recorded. They're always recorded, but sometimes that tape has been preserved at the Morgan Library, sometimes not. But when they're not recording for audio, that recorder is somewhere in the room. Yeah. Sometimes you wonder, why does it have to be
Hilton
underneath
Halls,
a jacket?
If you're listening,
Yeah.
Please just put it on the table next time.
Yes. Yeah, so anyway, that's what we're working with. And John is going to tell you a little bit more about how what's the process? How do we start with the magazine and end with a podcast?
Yes, we'll talk through this, and this is just sort of an overview of the steps of the process. We're going to get into a few more of the details. But unsurprisingly, the first thing that we have to do is curate the material. We've got a season's going to come out a year from now. We have to pick what's going to go in it. So again, the components are fiction, poetry. These, again, they're really known for the interviews. And so we're trying to find stuff that's going to work in the podcast. And we're also pulling from the archive, again, 70 years of amazing work, but we're also trying to pull from new writers. We want, again, one of the Paris Review's big selling points is you buy the issue for Hemingway, the Hemingway interview, but then you turn the page and you discover a new cutting edge writer. So what we were trying to do with the podcast was curate in a way that would do that would mix old voices, new voices, the classic, the celebrity, and then also just the new modern writer who you need to know about. So the curation process really is Helena and I will typically drive it, but we try to get the editor of the Paris Review to submit, what do you want this season to be about? What works do you want to highlight? What pieces from the archive did you really care about? And then we suggest some things, and then there's this list. And then from there, like Sarah was saying, like there are some things that just work in print. That's it. We read them, we're like, that is an amazing story. It made me cry. It is not going to work in audio. And we'll talk a little bit more later about sort of how we decipher and decide what is good for audio. But that's the first step of the process, is really just getting a pool of candidates. We read through it and we sort of decide what's going to really pop in audio. And it's not always, it's a combination of that and also just trying to curate a season that's going to be interesting, that's maybe going to have a little bit of gravity between the pieces. But it's a really fun process. And again, we're looking at fiction. And so sometimes we're like, well, that's a great story, but it is, 20,000 words. And like, we don't want to do a two-parter. So sometimes it's just that. The word count is a filter. But that's the first step. And then through that whole process, we get a list of candidates.
And then we have our pieces, and then we have to edit. The biggest chunk for, like, the biggest work in editing is with the interviews. Because, as I said before, like, you have maybe 7, 8, sometimes 10 hours of tape, and we have to sift through that.
I think Sharon Olds was literally like 8 hours of audio to listen to.
Yeah, so that's a lot, And so what do we select for? Like, what are we trying to get out of that tape? What we're not trying to do is recreate the Paris Review print interview. It's there already, We're not going to do a 40-minute cut of someone talking about like the whole arc of their life. So what we're trying to select for is stuff that, as John said, pops in audio, and especially moments, because these are like very famous authors, and they're put on their pedestal, and they're, even just the fact of getting an interview in the Paris Review is some honor, that means that these writers are, that are really kind of the icons of our time. And so what we're trying to do is like, okay, sure, they're icons of our time, and they're people. And we want to make them sound kind of unobserved, because of course these interviewers also in a way wear them down, right? Like if you go there over and over again after, many months or many years, they start to just sound like themselves, and they form friendships with these interviewers, and they start talking about like childhood memories of like, oh yeah, like I used to live near this place. Like I had this neighbor who made the best chitlins, this is Edward P. Jones. Anyway, so you have all these little bits of tape that, do they really matter when it comes to, giving the, the final sort of version of like, this is what this author is about? Probably not, but it makes them sound alive. So that's what we're going for. And this Dream Fluff moment, of course, is like a great example of that. Poetry and fiction, we don't edit as much. Poetry, we won't edit. I mean, the poem is a poem. Fiction, we will edit a little bit. Sometimes there's a paragraph that needs to go. What we do most is really silly. It's just putting dialogue tags, like said blah, 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 right?
Yeah, like if you're looking on a page, you can see line by line that the dialogue shifted from this character to that. But in audio, so sometimes it's really boring. We're just adding like a dialogue tag, just so that the listener knows that if it's a single voice, we can switch back and forth.
Yeah, so it's like really, shortening a sentence, doing that dialogue stuff. It's really minimal. And then we go into recording, which is like another big choice where we really have to be like, okay, what do we, because like every adaptation that you do, whether it's for a movie or it's for audio, it's an interpretation, right? So you're like, we've read this short story and we decide in a way, like, what do we want to bring out in this? You have to choose. Like all of the ambiguities that are in the story, you can't possibly bring them to life because like whatever actor you choose to read that story, they're going to give that a certain slant. And so it's like up to us to find the actor that we think will bring out what we want most in this piece. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we are going to play you some clips, why we chose the people that we choose. But so we get the actor that we want. I mean, that is very presumptuous, but we've been very lucky that...
Sometimes it's the writer themselves who reads their story. And sometimes we have an actor, we had instances where like really good actors read a story, couldn't do it, and just like couldn't get into it, and then we had the author read it, and they nailed it. Other times, the author will read their own work and it just like doesn't quite work. You know, like they're able to conjure the world, but then to actually perform it is just a different thing. And it's no knock on the writers. It's like, again, they're like, well, I made this for print, not for an audio interpretation. So again, like Helena's saying, is like these choices of who reads it, like it's an interpretation, you know, and we're trying to do our best to honor like the work that is there. But there's like all these micro choices that we make along the way. And I think like when we get into like the casting and the recording, that's when we're like, you know, and again, we'll dive into this more like coaching or read, but I think like, I don't know what you think, but I feel like that's the moment when we are most engaged with the work and maybe like the most nervous about like, are we making the right choices? Yeah.
And it's so cool because you have an MFA, right?
No.
No? Why do I think that?
I did one semester at Brooklyn College, and then I had a nervous breakdown, and then landed ass backwards in public radio. And I'm here because of that nervous breakdown. So.
Okay. Oh, well, the reason I was asking you that was, you know, I studied literature and, you know, all that, and I did that for 4 years. But I feel like the deepest that I've ever gone into a piece of literature is while coaching these reads with actors, you know? We had Jason Alexander in the studio to read a short story by Philip Roth. Jason Alexander, so also we don't pay these people, you know? So they come in totally for free, they don't have to say yes, and they somehow do.
We pay some of them.
We pay some?
Yeah, we
Well,
offer.
but not
We
Jason
offer.
Alexander.
Jason Alexander's like, it's Philip
Yeah,
Roth. I'll do this.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not monsters. We pay some
Oh, no,
people.
yeah, well. And, you know, he came in and we asked, like, okay, do you want an annotated copy of the story? Because, like, we went through and marked, color-coded all the different characters, because there were, like, maybe 6 different characters, you know, so that he could tell them apart and do the voices, whatever. He was like, no, I've done that at home. I've prepared, you know. That was already so great. And then, you know, he starts reading the story, and there's this point where, I can't remember exactly what it is, but, you know, he reads something sort of slyly, and John and I are like, well, I think this person at this point is angry. And Jason is like, I hear you, and I'll do that. I'll read an angry version. But here's why I think it was sly. And then he goes into this literary analysis of like what he thinks at that point is happening in the story and why. And John and I were like, you're right. It's not angry, it's sly.
Yeah,
you know?
it's like, I think the word is exegesis, is like when you do like a real close read of what's the meaning. And so when you're doing like an exegesis of a Philip Roth story with George Costanza, you're like, this is next level surreal. But it is, it's just like, it's the most fun because you're going line by line and working with an actor, like, well, what is the motivation here? What do you think happened? I mean, it's so in depth. So like, this is probably the part that like feels like it takes the longest, but also I think this is the part where it's like game time and we get really excited to get into it. And it's like, I'm like, I got this one, Helena. I can coach the read if you can't make it. And she'll be like, what are you talking about? I'm going to be there. So like, we just love being in the studio together at that stage and like working really closely. And again, before we've gone in there in this editing process, you know, we've also absorbed the script. We've made notes. So again, when we're talking about adapting something that we both hold in really high regard, that the world holds in high regard, and I don't think there's ever moments where we feel like paralyzed, like we're like, it's an adaptation. Like, you know, we may get some moments wrong, we may get it's okay. But we have fun with it, but we also, it's like, we really, and you know, I mean, if you're working in anything, non-narrated, narrated, whatever, you know what difference it makes to be really involved in your script and to really pay attention to like, is that line doing the work it needs to do? We just happen to be working with a script where a really good writer has already done a lot of work to decide how that language should work, and our job is just, again, to adapt it and try to make a version of it that is going to make people excited about the language and maybe make them pick up like the actual book and read, you know. Yeah, sorry, we should keep going. This is what happens. Helena and I will keep talking.
Let's just breeze through this, right?
So curating, editing, working with the interviews, working with the stories, recording, and then we get to sound design. And again, we'll dive into this a little bit more, but this is sort of like where you're really, another fun stage, but you're deciding where to put scoring, what kind of scoring, where to use sound. Does the poem even need scoring, or do we just keep it out of the way? So that's a whole nother level of decision making. We are the sound designers. We've had Hannes Brown has sound designed a couple episodes for us. And And typically, like, that's also a very iterative process. So Helena will do a pass, send it to the team, or send it to me. Usually what we do is she does a pass, sends it to me, I do notes. Vice versa, I'll do a pass, send it to her. And we do our first round of notes here. And then once we feel like it's hitting a certain like mark, we send it to the team, and then we get another round of notes. So it's a process. Again, we'll play a couple of moments and we'll dive into that. And then it's the final product. And you know, the first 3 seasons we did this sort of magazine, multiple authors. This 4th season we changed that, and it was 1 work or 1 writer per episode, shorter. That helped us get a longer episode season run, which was really nice. But again, it was more based on an artistic sort of instruction that came from the editor, like, let's really focus on 1 writer or 1 work, which we really enjoyed. Okay, and then there was one other question that we talked to Sarah about, and again, this is a show without a host. I mean, you hear the editor, and the genesis of that idea was that the review itself doesn't have criticism. And there's not like, in 1985, Jamaica Kincaid was living here, blah, 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 when this happened, and then the piece. No. You just read her work, you turn the page, there's a poem. You turn the page, there's an interview. That's it. There's not a lot of, and the interviews have a little bit of that introduction, sure. But for the most part, it's a reading experience, and you just get to turn pages. So what we wanted to do initially was mirror that and keep, the editor was going to be a voice, but we wanted them just there to do the table of contents like you'd get an issue, and then come in at the end. Every now and then you hear the editor interviewing or talking to someone, they sort of appear as a character. But, so we adapted that from the review, but honestly, it's like, I think that in audio in general, it's based on the idea that, like, you can trust your listeners, that a lot of times we think they need a lot of context and a lot of hand-holding and signposting, when in actuality they don't. They can figure it out. But what that meant for us was, if you finish a poem and you turn the page, you look out the window, right? Like, you don't just like turn the page and immediately dive into the first paragraph of the next story. Even if it's just a moment, you sort of absorb. And so the one thing that we started developing, and you'll hear it more in the first 3 seasons, is sort of these interstitial moments. And those were meant to just sort of give you a little sonic bridge, a little scene where and it's connected to the story, comes out of it, but a little space for your brain to sort of process.
Yeah. And then the last season has a new editor, Emily Stokes, and she listened to the first 3 seasons. It was like, okay, that's great, but I'm a new editor and I want to do things a little bit different. So how about we don't do that interstitial stuff anymore? And John and I were like, ugh, that is sort of that is what we do. That is what the podcast is. I don't know if we can take it away. So it took some doing and some discussions of like, okay, but what is it that, you do want? And because we speak audio and she doesn't really, it was like, a little uncomfortable in the beginning to be like, okay, but what do you want it to sound like? But as we went more through like the kinds of pieces that she was drawn to, a lot of journals, a lot of like diaries, like people who just write about their real lives as they are happening. John and I were like, oh, but we recognize that. That is what audio is good at too, right?
The Bob Gluck story, which is like a very, very written piece of literature, but it is very like it would read like if you got into a room with him and he told that. It's like
the Bob Gluck story is a story about a man who loses his lover of many years to AIDS. So that it really happened to him.
Yeah. That was true, but yeah.
Yeah. So we ultimately came out to this new term that would kind of like guide us through our format, to use the word like vérité, like the French kind of style of movie making, where the process is sort of part of what you hear. You hear the stumbles of the people holding the camera and holding the mic and stuff. So we wanted to do that, and we wanted to really bring in the different texture, like foreground the fact that this is recorded, and so we foreground the different textures of recording. And John will tell you a little bit more about a clip where all these different textures are really obvious.
All right, so that was our big overview. Now we're going to get into the fun part where we're just going to do some listing, and we'll sort of point back to these clips and talk about some of this, the finer points. Okay, so we're going to stay with Sharon Olds for this clip. What you heard before was a moment that sort of happened a little bit later in the interview. What we're going to play now is the beginning of the episode. And up here, this is the issue that the poem first appeared in. It's a poem. Again, we curated the material, and Emily Stokes, the editor, loves Sharon Olds. Sharon Olds was going to be interviewed in the 2023 issue. So she said, let's, again, one episode, one person. Let's put a frame around one writer, Sharon Olds. And so we said, all right, we've got the interview tape from Jess Lazar. That's that texture. That's NYU, where we are, where Jess Lazar interviewed Sharon Olds. And as you heard in the beginning, and you'll hear in this clip, in the beginning of this one, you actually hear like the dong, like it's like the hallway bell. Like you really get this place-specific audio. You can hear that it's sort of an echoey room. Again, it's the verite. It takes you there. Also, then we're trying to find, we're like, well, should we have her record a version of this poem, Sisters of Sexual Treasure, from her first book? And then we found online the listening booth for the Harvard Woodbury Poetry Room, where she did this reading back in like 1980, reading this poem. So it's like this beautiful recording of like a younger Sharon Olds. And you hear that juxtaposed, right? So texture one, texture two. And then you won't hear it in this clip, but we then got Sharon Olds into the studio, the cutting room. This is actually the room where she recorded, not too far from here, and she read stuff on mic. So again, that proximate in-studio, really quiet, professional sounding recording, that texture is in there as well. And then this guy on the left here was sort of, as I was building the intro to this, I was just like online. I've listened to all these hours of the interview. I have found this poem. And then I was like, let's see if we can find any archival stuff on YouTube. Great source. And so we just borrowed a bit of his intro to Sharon Olds, which just felt like, great. Now we don't need to use the host to say, ladies and gentlemen, Sharon Olds. You know, we don't need that because we have him doing it. And by the way, we got, Paris View is one of those institutions, you call the Woodbury Room, they're like, yes, permission. You called Emory University, they're like, yes, permission. So we did clear everything. But these are, again, what you're going to hear in this beginning opening of this episode of the Sharon Olds. I mean, listen to the textures, and then also just listen to how it takes you without any introduction or signposting into different spaces, into different periods of time.
Content warning.
Oh, content warning.
Sorry. I'm here with the educational content and the content warning, but it's just, this whole season, also back to, I guess the input of the new editor, there's a lot of sex in it, just so you know.
I used to have a nightmare all my life until I was maybe 30 that I was late for my execution. And I couldn't imagine what they would do to me. I mean, I was going to be executed, and in a Christian way, right? So, or a Roman way. Not crucifixion, that would have been too vainglorious or something. I think often it was, Heliogabalus. He had a bull made of bronze that was huge, maybe the size of this desk, on legs. And he would put someone he didn't like in it and then build a fire under it and then essentially roast his enemy to death while hearing the screams. I would dream. I would have that nightmare the night before a reading. That fear of being judged and killed slowly. Being killed, not good, but who cares compared to pain and horror and misery and hideous pain. Okay. And then gradually I suppose I got better at readings. I was good at readings, and I kind of began to know that, and that I hadn't realized this until this moment. I am a performer. I like doing that. Am I nervous? Not so much as I used to be before my religious conversion, whatever that is, taking mercy on myself more. Mercy on me. Mercy me. Okay, we're going to turn this on, and you're going to ask me a question, and I'm going to answer it.
It's on.
Oh, it's on.
We should all thank her for letting us know what our lives are like even as we live them, rather than long after. Ladies and gentlemen, Sharon Olds.
Oh, thank you so much. Hi. My name is Sharon Olds, and I'm going to read some poems from my first book, Satan Says. Satan Says was published in 1980. The Sisters of Sexual Treasure. As soon as my sister and I got out of our mother's house, all we wanted to do was fuck. Obliterate her tiny sparrow body and narrow grasshopper legs. The men's bodies were like our father's body. The massive hocks, flanks, thighs, elegant knees, long tapered calves. We could have him there, the steep forbidden buttocks, backs of the knees, the cock in our mouth, the cock in our mouth. Like explorers who discover a lost city, we went nuts with joy, undressed the men slowly and carefully, as if uncovering buried artifacts that proved our theory of the lost culture, that if Mother said it wasn't there, it was there.
Okay. Can you remember first writing about sex or first using words like cock and cunt and, talking about blowjobs?
Well, I didn't use them at first.
Yeah, so that's great. But also the roasted anecdote was not in the print review. So I can't believe that it wasn't in there, but we got to use it. Okay, this next clip is from a short story by River Solomon. The story is titled, "This is Everything There Will Ever Be." And one of the reasons that we picked it is because it's a story with a very strong protagonist, so you can really follow them. What doesn't work often is when you have too many different characters, because in audio, it's hard to tell them apart, of course. It's not like on the screen. Here, the main character is a very complicated woman, sort of belligerent, and she's sort of hard to love, She's belligerent, fatalistic. She doesn't really like doing things. She's kind of resentful when people suggest things to do. But despite this unlikability, there's this tenderness that is in the point of view of the writer for this very complicated main character that just shines through like this golden hue throughout the whole story. And it's subtle, but it's in there. And I think John and I, when we read that story, were like, ooh, like it just really hits you hard, the tenderness with which this character is drawn. So we needed someone, an actor, who could really bring that out. And we were lucky enough to have Lena Waithe agree to read. And Lena
Also, she read the story and was like, everybody in our team read the story and was like, this for the season, please. But like Lena read it and was like, yes, immediately.
Yeah. And it will never stop to surprise me that these people that I think are like sort of unattainable, you know what I mean? That they're just like, yes, absolutely. And I wish, I really would like to tell you more stories about coaching actors because it's so fun. But in this case, there was no coaching to be done. John couldn't be there for that one. It was just me. And I was so ready to, and no, Lena just read every paragraph or sometimes every sentence and would just read it as many times. I didn't have to prompt her. She would just do it again until she heard, yes, that's the one. And it was the one. She knew that this unlovable character needed to be loved. And she was going to do that.
But I also have to say, so Helena is an excellent excellent coach ever read. What was the poem?
By Danez Smith.
Danez Smith, reading their own poem. And good reads. And then Helena was like, you know what?
Because here, Danez Smith is like a performer. Yeah. He's used to standing in front of a crowd, doing slam poetry, doing all this stuff, where like you really want to get a crowd like excited, So he was doing that, this projecting thing where like what I'm doing now, like you're talking to the back of the room, which in audio, when you have it right in your ears, you don't want that, right?
Now, can I? I'm gonna try and like this. I'll do my Helena impersonation. Tanez, hold on. That's good, but if you can just pretend that you're in a bar, you know, one of those good bars with good lighting, like maybe you can still smoke cigarettes in the bar, like it's that time, and like your friend is just sort of wandered in off the street, and you've like had 2 drinks, so you're kind of relaxed. You're so happy to see them, and they sit down, and you're just feeling warm, and then you tell them this poem. And Tanez was like, yeah. And then did this take that was exactly that. But so Helena's like very, very good at coaching reads and getting people to understand sort of the tone that we want. And a lot of times we say with actors, like instead of acting to the back of the room, the version of acting to the back of the room is just a little extra enunciation and pacing and making sure there's space around the words. But in this case, I would say that like, because Lena came in, like you were prepared, but you also knew that you were hearing, like what you heard was right.
Yeah. And it was just, I think, sort of the kismet of Lena recognized something in that character. Okay, so I'm going to play a clip just to set it up a little bit. So this protagonist is a disabled, genderqueer shut-in in her 50s. She has, at this moment in the story, just given herself a new name to mark a new chapter in her life, away from the abuse and humiliation that she suffered for her whole life at the hands of her family. Her new name is Julius.
With a name like Julius, gender came up. It had before, too, being that Julius was never a feminine woman in the traditional sense. And while she preferred to just get on with life, life itself never let her. It kept on harping and harping at her in the forms of stares, paperwork, awkward conversations, slurs. That's not life. That's society, said Wilbur the first time they met at an LGBTQ+ sober social. It was the November after the name change, after the attempt. They were the only 2 over 30, Wilbur, 31, she, 48. They were also the only 2 black ones. Wilbur was transmasculine and non-binary, which Julius didn't understand. She got it even less when he tried to explain it to her during one of their early hangouts, because everything he said about being non-binary also applied to her as a woman. But when she asked more questions, she could tell Wilbur found them invasive and that he was writing her off as a person who didn't and never would get it, as a person with whom he could never be close. And this devastated her. So Julius told him, as it seemed relevant and like something that would make him love her, that she'd had a double mastectomy, breast cancer. And she wasn't particularly upset about it, had declined reconstruction. She never felt attached to her breasts anyway. I'm sorry to hear that you had cancer, he said solemnly. The next day he sent her a message, a picture of a very angry, sodden cat in a bath. There was an arrow pointing to the cat alongside the words, me trying to get on with my life. And there was an arrow pointing to the bathwater next to the word, society. Julius laughed and replied, why are memes always so specific to my exact emotional state? Because we're all connected, Wilbur said, and you're not alone. Would you like to go to a poetry reading with me tonight? She didn't reply. And that night, she cried until she made herself sick and vomited in the toilet, God knows why, and then went to an AA meeting, which was useless, then walked all night until she could not walk anymore and fell asleep on a park bench, only to be woken at dawn by the sound of a jogger, music bleeding from their headphones.
All right. Can you talk a little bit about now I'm like interviewing you. Can you, because I think this is one, again, because of the tenderness of the story, like scoring and sound designing this one, I remember being, like it was a very careful process, but can you talk about like how you search for scoring maybe through this piece?
You know, when you're scoring a story, and I don't know if any one of you knows APM Music Library, there's a lot of music in APM, which is a godsend and also a curse. And often when I start, like for one story, I try to find something that is a little coherent, right, with the rest of the story. And so I was trying to hit on like the right tone for this story. And it was hard because I felt like there was something very hard-edged about the character and sort of resistance that made you kind of not want to be there with her as she made decisions that were just terrible and, you know, self-destructive. And I wanted people to listen. I wanted people to hear that, no, actually, this person is aching for love, aching for warmth. So I tried to find music that was achy and warm, just as a compliment, I think, to everything that this person was so desperately trying to not be, because it would be too vulnerable, but that she actually was. Yeah.
And then it's also like the placement of the songs, again, to find the right piece, to find the right place for it to come in, where, again, like it's the sort of the strings during a love scene, or like, you know, true crime things where it's like everything's like string stabs and everything. You're just like, it's you know, Gilding the Lily or whatever the true crime equivalent of that is. You know, I think that like this one, again, I don't know if you remember how many music cues you tried, but like it's like really painstaking. You're like, try this, try that. Oh, it's getting closer. It's getting closer. Try the stem. Oh, no, everything's good until second 45, and then, you know, it's a real process. And I think that when you have a read as good as Lena Waith's too, it's like suddenly like you're the other actor on stage, and if like your scoring is wrong, or it's like bad, I would say it's like bad lighting. People don't notice unless there's a mistake. Lighting is just in the background. But I just thought like this piece, like from beginning to end, like all of the scoring is just so tasteful. And again, it's that same thing, the idea of the tenderness. How do we adapt that? Like everything, just. But it's a process to get there.
And also, I think, you know, if anyone has listened to previous seasons, there is a lot more scoring and sound design in previous seasons. We just really went for it, you know, and because that was sort of not, you know, in line with Vérité, you know, we tried to kind of, you know, rein it in a little, which is also why we try to stay more of the way with music. But there were moments where John and I were like, okay, but this one, so this jogger at the end, oh, I had so much fun making that, you know, just like imagining the protagonist lying on this park bench, and then this jogger with music bleeding from her headphones running by. And I used like this plug-in that's like a, well, how do you pronounce the word? Goniometer?
Goniometer?
Yeah, to just be like, okay, here is the jogger in space. I was
It's
told that
spatial,
this
like
is
it's a
not
spatial audio thing, right?
stereo, so you couldn't hear it. But if you hear it on headphones at home, you know, like, okay, now the person is here in space, the footsteps, so I have to cue the music exactly so that, you know, so I had a lot of fun with that. But we haven't done a whole lot of that during this season. So it was a lot more restrained, which was very hard for us to do. Yeah. So, yeah.
I mean, if you watch that as it played, and some of you probably close your eyes and listen, but like sometimes sound design be like, I just sound designed this thing, and they'll do a screenshot of their Pro Tools or their Logic or their Reaper session, and it's like 100 tracks, and you're like, oh, Jesus. This season, there's a lot of it like this, where it's like, it's just ambi to take you into the social. And then it's just outdoor ambi and traffic ambi to pull you to the park bench. But then adding that little jogger becomes like this moment again. And we make the show, like there are more rewards the more intentional your listening is. If you listen in headphones, at night, laying on your bed, like even more. So like that was just like a moment that the end of this scene just sort of closed it and creates a transitional movement to the next scene.
Okay. So our next, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Our next clip is a visit that we did to a place that has not seen too many poetry readings with a poet. We thought it would be fun to go to IKEA with a poet, Maggie Milner, who had written a poem about an IKEA bed. The editor of the magazine was not impressed with our idea. She thought it was too gimmicky. She thought it would just be corny. Yes, of course. But we both thought that it would be really fun too. So she let us have this win.
Try it.
Yeah.
try it and I'll listen. And then, you know, she liked it, but I think the idea evolved because it started with just Maggie's poem, which is in that center issue. Again, a new writer. She lives in New York, great poet. But then you want to talk about like the genesis of sort of how it became a poetry reading?
Yeah, because we try to first do one, the IKEA bed, which again is sort of a sexual poem, so another content warning, IKEA bed poem at IKEA. But then we thought like, okay, since we're in this place that is not exactly known for being conducive to the poetic life, let's change that. And let's have her bring in some other poems. Like, let's have her curate some poems that she likes from the magazine. Really old ones, or really ones that, again, like there's a Rilke poem that she chose, which is like from the early 20th century, you know. I just, the idea of Rilke in an IKEA made us both crack up. So that's in part why that's in there. And then, of course, we had to find these little scenes to put her in, right? So she reads a poem about cooking a chicken in a kitchen. Obviously, she reads a poem about death in a...
Well, that one we didn't know where we were going to do. And at first we're like, maybe we'll do it in the fake because it was like pandemic time. So they had the fake like work from home office. We're like, well, that feels like death. But then we walked by the external storage closets. And she was like, how about in here? And Helena, you won't hear the scene, but she's like, vertical casket. Maybe a little bit on the nose, but it also makes for a great, again, back to the verite, like the sound of that door closing and like the sound of IKEA just sort of vanishing. I don't know, it's really fun in sound.
And so again, for the verite, like, you know, we have the stumble of like the recording process in there. So you'll hear in the clip that you'll hear how we hook up Maggie to the recorder. Put that through your shirt so that the cable is not visible.
Like so. Okay.
And then this is the thing that you want to clip on your shirt near your mouth.
This I put in my pocket.
And you probably, the cable is way too long, so you probably want to kind of stuff it in your pocket.
The eagle has
I'm going to
landed.
give this a couple minutes.
Okay, can I see it again?
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna leave my coat in here. Music. Okay, in we go. It's a slow day at IKEA. Slow to normal. Hi, excuse me. Where are the showroom for the bedrooms?
You haven't reached there yet.
Okay, so we just keep...
Yeah, when you go to the path, you're going to walk into work IKEA, and then the next apartment after that is bedrooms.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, we follow the path. We follow the arrows. Okay, this is nice.
What would you call this?
This I would call a 2-tiered serving tray. I'm into this. I guess I don't really need it. No, when I was a kid, I was like a total tomboy, and now that I'm an adult and I live by myself, my home decor has changed. Now everything is pink. The clothes make you think I'm a goth, but if you come to my home, you'll see that it's actually extremely girly and frivolous. Yeah. Let me just take a gander over here. Wait, this is actually the bed. This is a slightly sleeker, slightly updated version of the bed. What are the odds?
I think the odds are pretty good.
Yeah, the odds are pretty good. We were at
In
IKEA,
IKEA.
and I'm, yep. Okay, yep, I'm feeling comfortable. This is like, I would say, a medium to firm mattress. So many pillows. I mean, which is, I would say, a requirement. Should I go for it?
Yeah.
Okay. Everyone had the same IKEA bed. She tied my wrists to hers above my head. She liked what she called clean lines, I would learn. Her major had been architecture. Sometimes when I lay there waiting, bound or free, I'd envision its assembly, the tiny standard issue wrench that torqued the socket of the bolt, drawing the particle board flush against the rails, the 100 screws, the greasy crossbar with its cues of stapled slats, the wooden dowels, which had seemed too large to fit their holes, that gently she'd forced in, the plastic pegs, the vinyl footboard trussed between the legs. Oh, there's a bathroom here too. A bathroom with a sign that says "Dreaming is free."
So the first thing I'll say about that is that like we had so much fun recording it. Like if you watch the three of us buzzing around that IKEA, like we were having fun. So I think when that happens, typically again, if it's in the studio or whatever, if you're like when you're having fun making something in audio, odds are like your listener is going to have fun listening to it. The other thing I want to point out is that if you watch that session, it's the sound design of this one is not sound effects. You know, it's not stuff coming from a sound effect library. We're not building anything. It is this, and some people think sound design is that. It's sound effects, you know. But I think sound design, like working with field tape, is like, that is one of the hardest things to do in sound design. To build the scene, this is probably 90 minutes of tape that we edited down to 12, and then getting it to sound seamless and getting it to go. But it also involved like pre-production. Before we went in, it's like, all right, here's the poems, here's sort of our arc. We want to hear going in, we want to hear going out. Let's make sure we get the textures. And then you're in there and just sort of like hunting for sound. But again, in the context of this season, like we wanted to get away from the in-studio stuff and get things out into the real world. And this was just a really fun way to do that. And then the other thing we talked about was the transport, which will be a segue to our next and last clip. But you know, we're taking the listener on a journey, and when it's in IKEA, the listener is now sort of perched on Maggie Milner's shoulder, sort of on this little poetry ride. So the transport of field tape and sort of again this idea of audio verite was something that we were really leaning into this season, which is a great setup for our last clip.
Because our last clip is from an essay written by Jean Garnett. And it's an essay titled Scenes from an Open Marriage, which is also what it's about. It's about Jean and her husband's decision to open their marriage and how that went. And the essay was published online, so it wasn't published in the paper magazine, and it went viral. And in it going viral, the internet did what the internet does with viral things. It just heaped hatred onto mostly Jean's husband, actually, because he was blamed for forcing her into this situation, which Jean thought was ridiculous, as if she's a person with no agency. And so when we approached her to, you know, do you want to read this essay for the magazine, you know, for the podcast? It's of course it's a little bit of a questionable proposition, right? Because like she's already been dragged through the mud. Why would we do that again? But what we told her was like, you know, what we want to do is give you the right of response. So what we want to do is for you to read the essay or a part of the essay, but especially we want you to react to it and just tell us, like, what was it like to write it? What was it like to have the world feel comfortable to share their opinions about, you know, your personal life? And that was what she was like, okay, sure, then I'll do it. And because we wanted, as John said, have that feeling of like, okay, we're really here with her, we're in the scene of her life. We wanted not to do it in a studio, but in her home, you know, the scene of the crime, so to speak. So we drove upstate and sat with her at her kitchen table. That is not her kitchen table, but it kind of looked a little bit like that. So let me see, do I have to set this up? No, okay, so there's two clips that are kind of stitched together. One is from the beginning, and then one is actually from the end. I don't know, do I need to say anything more? There's another content warning.
Well, I mean, I think there was a thing we talked about before that like the choice, and I think it's just something to listen to. When you get in a studio, there's like, they call it the red light blues. I don't know if you guys have heard that, but like when somebody starts recording, they like kind of freeze up and they can't do that thing they've rehearsed. But this, like the idea was getting her at the kitchen table, again, the idea of getting her to be less guarded.
Yeah.
And I think that like when you listen to her read of this essay, like as you hear her, she's very comfortable. And that had to do with Helena being a great producer, and also Lydia from the Paris Review came in And so there was like a very comfortable vibe, but it translates. And so, for me, by the way, like this episode is my favorite of the last season. I think this is like a breakthrough episode in terms of like adapting something, but adapting it in a way that really is just so audio specific. So I remember when you sent me the first draft of this, I was just like, fuck, this is good. Like we can make a few tweaks, but this is already just like so good. So anyway, let's play the clip. Yeah.
Hello, hello. Hi, yes, I can. I think we're on Upper Creek. Yeah, so I guess I'm nervous about the boundaries of the kinds of conversations that you want to have on the record. Yeah, I'm not sure I want to say everything I really think about open marriage on tape. Okay. Oh yeah, hello. Hi. Okay.
So we could sit in the kitchen. Maybe that makes most sense since there's three of us. Let me give you a croissant and make some tea. My name is Jean Garnett. Just like help yourself here.
Okay, I'm just
butter.
Did you want butter or anything?
And I wrote this essay, Scenes from an Open Marriage, and I'm gonna read some of it. Here I go. About 6 months after our daughter was born, my husband calmly set the idea on the table like a decorative gun. I said I'd think about it. I couldn't pretend to be that surprised by the proposition or ignorant of my part in engendering it. I was too tired. I was too busy. The baby. I had a deadline. I was reading. I was watching The Sopranos again. I was depressed. The experience was difficult to savor in the moment, but it lingered on, casting a glow. The next morning, walking near Rockefeller Center, I saw a pretty man and was instantly wet. I felt it with my husband too, driving up the West Side Highway that week. A saturated, suspenseful energy. The warm wind pawing the hairs on my arm, the charged space between our bodies, his tensing jaw and tendons. A defamiliarizing layer of awareness stole over our lovemaking, a sense of trespass on the well-known body. One night in the dark, I whispered into his mouth, "You're such a pervert." He whispered into my mouth, "Does it turn you on to call me a pervert?" I whispered into his mouth, "Does it turn you on to ask me if it turns you on to call you?" And before I could finish, we were both rigid with laughter.
Oh, okay. What?
Do it again, do it again.
That was so good.
Oh, perfect. Amazing. Should I keep reading?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Our new babysitter, M, has been coming to stay with us every few weeks.
So, again, the idea was to go to the kitchen table and get the read. But then, like, the choice in the episode is to actually hear the process of getting there. And there's time is condensed. Like, the getting the croissants on the butter is maybe 4 or 5 minutes of tape that comes down to 15. But you hear her sort of sip the coffee. And again, it's our idea for like how to get the good read and how to bring people into the domestic scene where this story is playing out. Let the listeners hear it, like build that as a scene, and it pulls them into the vibe and sets them up. So again, I just love the way the episode brings us into this essay. And then the other thing too is it's Helena is like that part of the essay is very funny and could not hold her laughter until the paragraph break, but like keeping that, because again, what we wanted with this, and there are parts that you have, go listen to it, it's just such a great episode, but there's parts where she stops and she goes, now this is the part where my husband, so again, we wanted that feeling that you get pulled into the essay and almost forget you're at the kitchen table. And then there's that scene shift where the camera pops out and you hear Helena laughing. Like we wanted that organic reaction because we wanted not just the essay, we wanted an adaptation that was in conversation with the essay, that was fresh for somebody who's read it or fresh for somebody who hasn't read it. So, all right. So that is the end of our clips and the end of our presentation.
Thank you so much for humoring us.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna ask some questions, and then if one of my students can hold this mic, they can turn it on too. That was so awesome. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
I loved that presentation. And I've heard this whole season. I hope everyone listens to the whole season. It is a great season. So I learned a lot listening to you talk, but I still have questions. So I guess one of my questions is like, it's so easy to fall into the trap of like literal sound design, which can sound so cheesy. So like, how do you avoid the cheesiness? Like, how do you think about that?
Okay, can I tell an awful story about that? Yeah. Okay, so when I saw the job or the listing on the listserv of this job, we were looking for a producer for the Paris Review. I thought, oh no! I immediately reacted and was like, I want this job. And then I thought, they're never gonna hire me because a year ago I sent an angry email to the Paris Review podcast to say, look, I love the podcast, but what is up with the literal sound design?
I didn't know. I didn't.
I have not confessed that till
Can
now.
you forward that to me? I would love to read
Nope.
that.
I can't find that email anymore. Yeah. So, but I was hired anyway. So yeah.
Well, and thank God we did. But I think that there is also, again, like when we were talking about like the sort of sparseness of it, when I did the first season and I did a Third Coast presentation many years ago where I played the Dennis Johnson story, car crash while hitchhiking, and the actual car crash scene. Like and somebody I think sent a note back, was like, this is how Michael Bay would sound design it. And I was like, fuck, that's wrong. But we had Wallace Shawn reading Dennis Johnson. Great writer, great actor, great performance. And I had screeching tires and all this stuff. It was so over the top sound designed. And it was Chris Bannon, who was just like, you've got Wallace Shawn. He's like, just get rid of that. And like, let him have, like, there are moments where you want it, but there are moments where you don't. And so like this show is not perfect. It didn't come out of the gate perfect. There are a lot of moments in the first season that I listened to. I'm like, oh, I would go at that with much more restraint now. But it's been a process of finding it. But I would say like one of the best ways to avoid bad literal sound design is to have a team of really trusted ears, because also get a great reader, because when you have Lena Waithe reading, like you don't need to lean in too much. The world is being created right there in the language and the performance. But I also still am like a fan of like, try literal sound design, throw the spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. So I'm all for like trying it. But the other thing that I said in the presentation back in the day was that like literature, when you're reading it, is literally co-creation in the sense that the writer has put it there and now your brain is creating everything, supplying the faces, the backdrop, the scenery, the sounds, everything. And so what we're trying to do is something in the middle. And if you do too much literal sound design, what you're effectively doing is crowding out the listener's ability to co-create. So I don't know, it's something that I'm like still learning to do and when to do, but like sometimes the urge is like, oh, I'm gonna sound design the fuck out of that tea kettle, and you do it, and then you just mute it when you realize you don't need it, but you try it, you know.
Yeah, I mean it's. I was listening to one of the short stories. I think it was the Peter Orner story, and it's like if you're listening, like as an audio producer listening, it almost felt to me like the sound design had its own narrative that was like parallel to the narrative in the story. But it's also like so sparse. Like it comes in and then it fades out and then it's music, which has its own emotional narrative.
No music in that one.
Oh, not that one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess I'm mixing up two in my head. Right. Oh, that's right.
But that one is like,
Yeah.
it's mostly ambi. Again, very
Yeah.
sparse. A lot
Yeah.
of our sessions, if you look at the track count for this season versus previous, there's so less. Yeah. But the only time you'd really get like, it's playground ambi, which is just a stereo track. Or like the Lena Waithe scene, it's just park ambi. But then what it's that interstitial moment, that sort of break between paragraphs or chapters where you hear the jogger go by. Yeah. in the River Solomon, or you hear the children run by. And so like the literal sound design still will happen, but it'll just be in these little spaces sort of in between paragraphs.
Yeah, but what I like too about what you do is like, they might not say like specifically like, you know, like I was at a cocktail party, but like there's something in the writing that suggests they were at some kind of party sometime, and then you put in the party sound. Like it's sort of like you're kind of thinking beyond what's on the page. It seems like that to me.
There's scenes where we get to do that, yeah.
So, you know, let's talk a little bit more about your approach to poetry on the podcast, because I feel like poetry, even though some people say like it's meant to be heard, you know, like I feel like often it just like doesn't work in audio. Like it just like falls flat, or like there's like this preference for narrative. Yeah. So it's like, how do you, but you do it really successfully. So I guess, you know, how do you win people over with poetry? How do you think it does work?
It's too bad that we're not playing you the Terrence Hayes episode, but I think, you know, like I really love that Terrence Hayes poem because it's more like a song than like a poem. You know, we're not trying for narrative, but Terrence Hayes is playing on words for black. He's like pretending to be
It's called
Bob Ross.
Bob Ross Paints Your Portrait, yeah.
Yeah. And Bob Ross supposedly is painting a portrait using only black paints. And so Terrence Hayes is using all these different words for black and making it really tactile about, you know, he's telling you not to, in that sort of suave Bob Ross voice, he's telling you not to use a pencil, but to dab with your finger. And so you hear him sort of be very tactile. But his joy in the words is just more like a song. Like, does it really matter what it's, I don't know, like maybe some of you like listen to sort of this bard and sing like a song that has a story, but most of music is just the pleasure of sound. And I think that's what we try to do with poems. You know, it's like, yeah, it's not a story. You're just listening to a song. It just happens not to be sung.
I think like we've did one John Ashbery poem because we had a great recording of him doing it, but we did that like really late in the season. We're like, we're going to really earn people's trust before we do it. But we do tend to like curate poetry that has a song like rhythm, but like visual, or that there is a character or a scene. I mean, again, I think poetry is probably the place where it's the clearest. This is great on the page, but isn't going to work on audio. Fiction, there's a bunch of stuff in the middle where we can be like, can we make it work? Does it work? But I think poetry, like it's usually pretty instinctual. Like this will work in sound or it won't.
Mm-hmm. I mean, what also helps is, of course, having the poet in and say like 2-3 words about this. We had Monica Yoon come in. She wrote this amazing poem about Twinkies, and she wanted to do it about sort of the double meaning of like Twinkie, you know, the sort of disgusting kind of pastry, whatever you even want to call it. I'm not American, I don't know. And then the sort of racial slur. And she told the story of just like how in her high school there was this urban myth that was going around about like Twinkies are like not baked, but they're foam extruded, yeah, like something, you know, they're like whatever, just
like
solidified foam.
Yeah, they're made by some weird chemical process.
Yeah, exactly. And then she was also talking about the racism in her school. So that's kind of a way to just very quickly, without having a whole introduction to it, just get into the sort of like, what is this poem really about? And then you can get into it without needing a story, I think.
Which is also true, because I think like poets are the ones that most often we'll be like, get a little conversation with before, like more often with poetry than fiction or anything else, we will use a little bit of conversation with the poet before a poem. Right. And again, that's like also because what we're trying to do is like, we both love literature, both love poetry, both love fiction, have loved the Paris Review, and we want more people to like it, and we want more people to feel like poetry is accessible. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes it's like, oh, that's a complicated poem. Let's get a little bit of preface, and so that people feel like, oh, I can do poetry. And so I don't know, I think that there are, again, like the Monica Yoon poem is beautiful, and I think like if we would have played that without the context, like it just wouldn't have worked for a lot of listeners.
Yeah, or like the Terrence Hayes poem, he talks about like how nervous he is as a person, just sort of temperamentally, and how he was trying to write that Bob Ross poem in the Bob Ross voice to slow himself down. And like the way that he sort of kind of mimics that voice, you can hear that like, oh yeah, it is kind of therapeutic. Like I get, like sure, you can meditate or you can pretend to be Bob Ross, And so that's also a way to sort of get into the world of the poem.
Yeah, I love those little. I feel like you like include scenes in all these really creative ways that are often about like the process of even making the podcast. So it's like feels like the fourth wall you're breaking.
What was
like,
the Jenny Slate did the poem by? Anne Sexton. But it was like the poem itself, like you built like the sound design of like Jenny Slate as Anne Sexton, like coming out onto a stage and reading to an auditorium, and then the sound of the auditorium faded until her voice was just proximate. And it was almost like the scene that you built really didn't have anything to do with the poem itself, but it just made such an engaging listening experience that it just like pulls you into the poem, which is like, that's good. That's what we want.
A little ramp up. Okay, I'll just ask one more question, and then we can take some for the audience. Do you have a sense of like who your audience is? Who listens? Like who listens to the podcast?
My mom likes.
I was just gonna say my mom is my biggest fan.
Yeah, this is the one thing I've made that like my mom's like, I've listened to all of them. I was like, did you finish the one about the Mormon? Then she's like, no, it got dark. I was like, what about the one about the Boston Strangler? Nope. But she really likes it. Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. Like I think we imagine that it's like, again, we want people who are MFAs and who read to hear it and be like, oh, that's a cool adaptation, or it's a fresh. Like I don't know. I love The Great Gatsby, and I've seen all the movie versions, and I still think the book is better, but I really appreciate the movies because it's like a different adaptation. So we want people, I don't know, maybe this is like who we want our audience to be, but like I think it's a mixture of people who are MFAs, but I think it's also a mixture of people who are like sort of like lit curious.
I have to be honest, I make, whatever episode I make it for John. Truly. I just want, I want to entertain you, and I want to have you be like, oh, that was so, that was a great find, or,
same.
that's so my audience.
But that's where it starts. It's just like literally an audience of one going each way. And it's like, again, if we're having fun, or if I'm like, oh my God, that's so good, then we trust that like it will translate. Oh, that's so sweet though, that we're just like an audience of one for each other.
Thank you for anyone who listens beyond that. It's a win,
That's why you need a collaborator. Do we have some questions in the audience? I see one here. Andres, if you can bring the mic up. Benjamin Walker.
Thanks. This was really fun to listen to you guys, how to make this. I think I've listened more than I've read the magazine lately. And so I was kind of curious where Sarah was going with that. Do you have a sense of, do you have an audience that might not care about the magazine? I mean, more people care about literature than Paris Review. And you know what I mean? In other words, and also maybe your new editor doesn't like that. Like, do you have a sense of like where those things meet? Because I feel that speaks to so many podcasts that are connected to maybe another property, whether it be a magazine or who knows, a think tank or.
Is the term like, is it the virtuous cycle? Is that right? Where like you want to build things that are parallel that all feed into each other. Like I know, like from the first season, the second season, that like they had data that showed like when the podcast came out, like subscriptions went up. And could they definitively say that it was from the podcast? No, but we were bringing people in who maybe had never picked up the Paris Review, or again were afraid to, or just didn't know what it was. But again, like we're trying to bring people in through the podcast and be like, go to the website, you can get more. It's so cool to, by the way, to get like the review in the mail 4 times a year. Like it's always a thrill for me when I get it. Like I'm excited to see who's in it, and I start reading it. And so we're trying to pull people into that experience. But like, yeah, I don't know if we have like the data to know exactly like what the overlap is. I know that there are some people who love the review but don't like the podcast because again, they don't want the literal sound design. They would rather just hear a dry read of a story, which is like, that's okay. Then it's, not for them.
Are you also curious, in your question I heard something about like, is there a rivalry between the two? Is that what you? Oh. Absolutely. I mean, you really hit the nail on the head on what was the problem in the beginning with getting, the new editor and us to sort of on the same
every
page.
editor we've worked on. Yeah, there's
Sure.
yeah.
Because they know what works in print and not necessarily in audio. And, I think what is so cool about the Paris Review podcast is like, it's really a podcast for people who love audio, who love the possibilities of the form, and not just the content of the magazine that happens to be read out loud. No, it's like playing with sound. It's playing with like, what can you do in sound? And if you're a print person, of course you're not thinking about that. Why would you? So it's kind of our job to just get people excited, So like with the IKEA thing, I think our big, like what we just had to do was like make it and then show her, because there's no way that you can talk your way through what this does, Because the problem is not words, or like, words they know, it's the sounds that they don't know.
But there's like a fun thing, and I don't know, I feel like there are several people in here I know have probably like worked with print writers, bringing them into sound. There's like a fun moment when, because these are really creative people, when they start to go, that's what sound can do. And then they start suggesting ideas, or they start giving notes on mixes that are so astute. And so that, there was like a learning curve, but we got to a place where like, but then I also think it goes the other way, where I think there are times where, again, we need the reminder that like, hey, the language is all you need there. Just mute the tea kettle. So I think it's like, it goes both ways, that like, I like working with the Paris Review because it's just, again, it's a group of really, really smart people who know the language, who know the writers. And, this is our 4th season, so like, they like working with us because like we meet them. I think we do a good job of meeting them where they are. Yeah.
More questions? Hey, you can go to Tanya first.
It's amazing to hear from you guys. I'm a fan of the podcast. I'm not an MFA. I have an MFA. But I'm really excited to hear you talk about just experimentation and having the courage to try something and then, and show it to your collaborators and fail, which is something that seems like it only gets harder as time goes on and people start to like what you do, and then, all of a sudden you're sticking your neck out to like try something that just may or may not work. And so I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that, or how you find inspiration and how you find the courage to kind of throw down.
Yeah. Okay, so I was brought on for the 2nd season, and I wasn't there for the first. So it was already established.
She was sending us emails.
That's true. And so the first time that I made something and John was going to listen to it and give notes, I was terrified. I was shaking, like literally shaking, and nauseous, and like this, it was exactly like what you say, like it was so scary, and it is so vulnerable to share something that isn't finished yet, and it's not quite there yet, and that, but you also can't do better than what you did, so it's this really awkward thing. You're really showing like, this is the limits of what I can do, And then John was just so, generous and warm and reassuring. And I think what really makes this collaboration so fun for me is that you've never treated me like a lower than or whatever, or like an ingénue, or like, but always like someone who was just a peer playing also. Just we're 2 people playing. We're just 2 people having fun, and when you're deep into something, there's things that you won't hear because you've just done it too much, or you've developed a blind spot. And so you need a fresh pair of ears, and that's what John was. And he would never sort of pull rank or anything like that. And there was this one moment that I remember that I really love and cherish. It was, I was scoring, or like I was sound designing a short story by Edward P. Jones. And it's a story about a woman who she's elderly black woman, lives in a welfare apartment, and she goes to welfare to collect her welfare checks, and they stop coming, and she goes there to figure out what happened, and they let her wait, and they let her wait, and they let her wait, and she never gets her turn. And one day she blows up, and she attacks one of the people who works at the welfare office. And that's what the story is about. And the story is about this woman that would never get a story because it's not a big character. She would never get a movie. She would never get a romantic comedy or whatever dedicated to her. But I thought, this woman is a hero. She's like fighting the system in her own whatever way that she can. So I want to make her this big silver screen, or whatever. Am I saying this right? Yeah. A Hollywood hero. And so I used completely over-the-top golden era Hollywood music. And I had scored it big and beautiful, and then John had come in, he does the final mix of everything and had pulled down the volume on everything. And I was like, okay, sure, thank you for making my volume sound coherent. But at the end, I want the volume to be unreasonably loud. Like, I want this to swell, and I want the listener to feel that in their heart, and I want it to be over the top. Could you please make it like not a judicious level? And John was like, absolutely. Like, he believed that this was, this unreasonable volume was what I needed to tell, to share my vision, and sure, go for it. And anyway, I just like that level of trust, and the fact that I just get to play and feel safe as I do.
Sometimes it's like you just like that. I remember that, but it was like I didn't know what your intention was, and then you're like, no, I want her to have like this silver screen, like this swell of music is something that would be like in a romantic movie with the sun going down, and she's just this little old woman. And I was like, oh, that's what you're going for. And I was like, okay, cool. And then it just changed like how I thought about like sitting her voice or making sure I carved out the space. Then it wasn't so much level, it was a little bit more EQ. But like, again, that's like the fun part of like our first back and forth, which is, I think, just like, again, it gets better with every season because we just have a shorthand and also the trust that like before we send it out and have the nail biting moment of like, will the team at the Paris Review like this? Like, we're like, well, if we're aligned, we know there's a good shot they're gonna like 90% of this, So I think like over time, I mean, I still, from the beginning, I was like the lead producer on this project. So, initially the nail biting for me was sending it to Chris Bannon, Lauren at the Paris Review, and Jeff, and the other two people there who were sort of listening and giving notes. And I was just like making this stuff at night being like, I have no idea. Like, is this just like way the fuck out there? And I just like hit send at like 1 a.m. and then be like, I don't know, we'll see. And like, just like, I hope they like it. And then, they're like, yes, but like, pull back here, and we got there. But then after that, like, I was sort of in a position that like, when I mix something, like I could send out and be like, there's a couple seasons, they'd be like, that's great. I'd be like, no, but give me notes. So I got to the other point where I didn't want my work to be rubber stamped. And so the second season, when you were on, it was like, this is somebody with really smart ears, like critical ears to the point of sending angry emails about the first season. But I was like, here's somebody who's going to give me honest notes. And it was like, this is so good. Do you know what I mean? And so I think like, again, if like there's a lesson to take out to whatever project, it's like find ears that you trust, try things. And if somebody says no to something that you tried, then like explain like what you were going for. And then sometimes there's a chance through that collaborative moment to be like, okay. Then, if that's what you want, let's have it come in 10 seconds later and then post here, and you still get that, and it stays out of the way of the thing that I was trying to protect. That's just like the most marvelous process. And I really just like, I love that we have that first round is always like, I think where the big things, the big moves get talked about and sort of sussed out, which is just so valuable.
I love this like love fest. Well, I wish every team was like this. You had a question, I think. This person. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can talk about the decision to make the show seasonal as opposed to always on, because obviously the Paris Review has such a huge bank of stories and interviews. You could probably just have it, published every 2 weeks or something. Yeah. So I'm curious about that decision.
There's always been plans. I mean, especially it's like when this was made at Stitcher, it was like, we need more. We need, they want always on. With this, they didn't necessarily want always on, but the idea is like we wanted to get to the point that we could do like 4 5-episode things a year and have a more regular release cadence. But there was some turnover at the Paris Review in terms of editors that led to sort of slow down, and then getting this funded, and then getting resources for it. Again, this is like a high-touch art crafty process. I don't want to like break up the love fest by talking about my former employer on stage. But there was a point where like making something like this, I mean, they let the show go 4 months before they let me go. They didn't want to do this, and that's fine. They've got their lane, but you know, trying to get seasons greenlit, like we had a few champions on the inside. Also at the Paris Review, like Lori Dorr, who's their business manager, is just like a badass. And so we were like, let's make another season. And we would just figure out a way to get a presenting sponsor to pay for it. So a lot of it is just like people who really believe in the show. And again, there were some within my company who believed in it and were like, we got to keep making this because it's really good and people really like it and it's art and it's important and it's craft and it's great. But you know, and we still hope that we could make more. But also there's like something nice about the scarcity of it, and that like, you know, this season took 14 months from like start till release. And there's some frustrations built into that, but overall I think that's good. Like that's sort of part of it. Like, you know, I don't know, the musical albums that I love, it's like, you're like, oh, that one took 3 years to make. So, and if we did make more, like, would it be less produced? Would it be just more chat driven? Because people do that where it's like really produce stuff and then do a pocket of like bonus stuff. So I don't know, it's just got like a unique thing, but like the show has had its champions and the show has had like people who really care about making it. So I'm just like, I'm proud that we've gotten 4 seasons done. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, let me do like one more. Oh,
We could do 2.
Hi, we do 2 questions.
The hands are up.
Diehards. I didn't see you behind the projector.
No
Go
worries.
ahead.
Hey.
Hi, Lucy.
Hey, thank you for this. I was curious if you could talk a little more about your decision for when and where music exists in addition to under, on top of, versus sound. Because the clips you've played, the dialogue, all the sounds, the music, they're all characters that feel very equally weighted, even though obviously the reading is what's being put forward. And I'm curious if you could just talk a bit more about that decision.
Yeah, sure. So you said, when is music used besides sort of underneath the thing? Yeah. When you decide to bring them in and bring them out. Yeah. I mean, you know, it's interesting, right? And there are different schools about sound design. But I think our favorite ways to use music, I think, is to lend an intelligence to, you know how like point of view in, you know, like when you're a writer, you know, or when you want to tell a story, point of view is sort of where it's at, right? Like point of view is how you show what your relationship is to the character, how tender or sort of cutting you are towards the character. To us, that is what the music does. The music sort of lends an authorial voice to the story. It's kind of like an extra consciousness that is like, okay, you guys, I know that you've been cruising along here, but here we want you to sit up and listen because something's big is going to change. Or we're cruising along and this person seems nice and chatty, but like do not believe what you hear because this person is going to turn around and stab this other person in the back. And so we're going to signal that something is not quite right with music, you know? So it's almost like having another author, or the author, you know, is just like giving you little hints. So that is one thing. Another thing, of course, that's huge is pacing. You know, like when you read a story silently to yourself, like you have the magazine in front of you, you pace yourself automatically, you know? You will read a little slower when the sentences become longer and a little more circuitous. And when the action picks up and like you're about to find out who killed the girl, you know, like, wow, you start flipping the pages. We have to do that with music. And so I think a lot of what we do with music is like, let's pause the action here for a second. Let's let that image really bloom. And that's when we bring in music. Another reason is to sort of bookend a scene. When we're like, okay, that was a scene that was, like that park bench. He falls asleep. Main character in River Solomon's story falls asleep on this park bench after having walked all night after an unsuccessful AA meeting, falls asleep. Jogger walks by, that wakes her up. That's the end of the scene. What comes after that is no longer at the park. I can't remember where it is, but like that's sort of also to just mark like, okay, something is changing here. I think that's the most.
And I think like one of the fun things that we do is like we think about it on the page too, a lot of times, and then it can change once you're in the tape. But we'll be like, again, oh, this is a moment, and again, it's like you're reading and there's like an actual the little dot or whatever. I don't know what the term for it is, but there's a break. And you're like, that's where you'll read to and go refill your coffee, or it's where you look out the window. And sometimes that's happening. We're like, whoa, what they just said there. Like we know that somebody, even though there's not a chapter break, they would read slowly there. And so we will in the script be like music in here, which then also like influences how the read is, because we'll be like, hey, we're gonna put scoring in here. So when you read that last line there, like actually kind of slow your read down as if it's the last line of a chapter. And so then they'll read into music that isn't even there yet. But we're already thinking about how music is going to function, again, to slow action down, to underline something, to punctuate, or to like, again, like reset. And it's like park bench done, music in, 6 seconds, next scene starts, and kind of the music will go out, and now we're,
Oh, another thing that I love is the cool thing about music is that you can take it away, right? And when you take music away, suddenly that silence is very effective at snapping you too, So I think that's another great use of music, is to not have it. I mean, it allows you to not have it.
And I'm a big fan, I'm not a big fan of fade outs on music in scoring in podcasts. I do it on occasion where it feels okay, or if it's like crossfading with ambi, it's usually handing off to something. But because I really like music to function as like a, that stop, that the silence afterward takes you somewhere, or the music coming in. Yeah. But yeah.
I once heard like Leonard Bernstein say something about like what the role of a conductor is. And he's like, look, when you have like this whole symphony, like you can't expect people to be paying attention the whole time. It's like 45, 50 minutes. So the job of a conductor is to really be like, hey, now. And so I think that's also what scoring does.
Yeah, but that's nice. I like that. Bernstein.
Last question. Yeah.
I just have a question about what's in your bag of tricks for coaching writers. When you go to a reading and they've got their little stand at the back of the bookstore, and they tend to have this sort of mannered cadence where they kind of, I won't imitate it, but you know exactly what it is. And I'm just curious whether you run into that and how you kind of get them off their game and coach them into a more natural style.
Well, the Danez Smith example is good because, again, they are more of like a performative poet, sort of to the back of the room. So that was an exercise in getting them to sort of to harness that energy into a more conversational, quieter space. But then what you're talking about is like the ones that's the sort of mannered public speaking. How do you get them into the warmth? It's a really good question.
Bane of my existence, seriously. I mean, I work on this other podcast called Poetry Off the Shelf, where I just interview poets, and poets are the worst at this. There's this weird way of just it always being like a sermon or something. Like it has to be like, it drains the meaning out of the words too, right? And I find it really hard. What I usually do, because you don't want to make people insecure, that doesn't help, right? So what I usually do is I just let them read the entire poem exactly the way that they want it. And I'm like, that was so great. How about we do a few other versions where we just try things, and we'll make it really extreme, we'll try things, and like maybe it won't work, but it's just, it's just a way for us to play. And I might combine some takes, so like there's really no wrong way to read here. How about we do a version that is, and then you say something, like how about you pretend that you're just telling the story to a friend, or how about you pretend that, you're kind of angry, you're actually sort of aggravated. You're coming home late after your work and you're telling your spouse about this horrible thing that happened at the office, and just tell the poem that way. So I don't think that you want to immediately jump in and be like, actually, because it just makes people insecure and not perform any better,
But I will say, like we've coached writers to read their own material, or after like that was fun. But it's also, it's the exegesis, and like nobody has ever sat with them and been like, wait, let's try that paragraph again. But like really slow it down. And after that line, look at the table. And then go again. And they're like, okay. They enjoy it because, again, you're engaging with them on their material. And also I would say one of the things that we both care about doing is like, we know their work when we come in. You know, we're like, oh, this line. This is the line, Terrence, that just fucking breaks my heart. And they're like, oh, really? Like, you know what I mean? So there's a sort of like, they sense that we're coming at them respectfully and that we've done our homework. We've really read their thing closely. So when we give them notes, and it's really fun to like get a reader to like take the time and, you know, we'll like to read a, 10-page essay, like we'll take 2 hours. Whereas like if they read it live, they're just going and it's over in 15, 20 minutes. But we'll go like line by line, paragraph by paragraph, and try this thing. Like try this, now try this, and I don't know. I'd say the majority. Some of them like maybe don't enjoy it, but like the majority of them really like that. It's fun for them. Yeah.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you guys.
Yeah, this was fabulous. Everyone should listen to the Paris Review podcast if they haven't heard it already.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you guys.
Seriously.
Thank you, Sarah.